Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Judge Dredd lore? Don't look at me like that. You know I speak the truth, as the Imperium's boys in blue bear a rather blunt and overt resemblance to the walking mountain of badassery that is Judge Dredd, and they do pretty much the same thing as well, just on a slightly larger scale. Sometimes, at least. But joking aside, we will today, of course, be covering the Adeptus Arbites, the official policing force of the Imperium and the keepers of the Lex Imperialis. But first, it is my favorite sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the epic dungeon-delving strategy game with over 650 unique champions that can be equipped with hundreds of customizable and upgradable artifacts to take on the countless enormous challenges of Raid's dungeons, with everything from dragons to ice golems to the Fire Knight. You will never lack for challenges in Raid. And this week, we will spotlight the newest faction in Raid, the Sylvan Watchers. Hailing from the dense jungle forests of Mistwood, these tree-dwelling elves have developed a very strong sense of territorial integrity, and will generally shoot anyone who mistakes their lands for their own, or is even merely passing through. Yet they are not entirely insular, even having constructed a massive open-to-the-air city called Niersa, where they established official bonds of alliance and friendship with the nearby Shadow Kings and the dwarven realms of the mountains. But even the fastest of friends can never be relied upon entirely, and so the sylvan roster of elves, spirits of season and land, and monsters of nature stand ever ready to protect their homeland. But the little green elves are not the only news in Raid, as we also have some Christmas specials with the 12 Days of Raid. If you are a new player, you can go to the 12 Days of Raid link down below and enter your player ID to play a series of festive minigames for a chance to win some amazing in-game and real-life prizes. The event is running from December the 18th to the 10th of January, so there is still time. And for current players, there is also a nice little promo code for some extra goodies on the same site. So check it all out now by joining Raid today, using the link below or scanning the QR code on screen. And as a new player, you will get a free starter pack with some cool in-game loot to get you started with your conquest of Raid's dungeons. And better yet, the Ronda Rousey event is still ongoing. All you've got to do to gain the legendary champion based on the MMA pro wrestling megastar Ronda Rousey is to log in to the game for 7 days before February the 20th. And all of this loot can be found right here in your inbox when logging into the game. Now, on with the lore. Now then, the Adeptus Arbites, or the Arbiters as they are often referred to, is the official Imperial police force. This means that they are the only ones with actual Imperial authority, setting them rather starkly aside from local law enforcement, as it is important to point out immediately, not every police officer is an Arbites officer. In fact, it is quite the opposite. The overwhelming majority of law enforcement in the Imperium is local law enforcement, with sometimes entire solar systems or even sectors having only a single arbitrator assigned to it, as they only have sizable presences on larger, more important, or more volatile worlds. And We will get back to all of that in a second, of course, but you must forgive me, I've got to sneak in a little bit of a plug here for Judge Dredd. Because, again, the inspiration here is blunt, even by 40k standards, and Judge Dredd is actually one of my favorite old entertainment entities, and he's getting a little bit of a resurgent as the movie Dredd, forget about the bottom part there, with the titular main character played by Carl Urban, is an absolutely excellent movie that sadly failed to find an audience, much because of that 3D part there, as the movie came out just as 3D had fully and completely fallen out of favor. In fact, I remember the specific reason why I didn't go watch the movie in the cinema was because it was named Dredd 3D. Too bad for me, because again, the movie is absolutely excellent, and I highly recommend it to anyone who is even just a fan of action, not even Judge Dredd himself. And many of the Judge Dredd comics that used to feature in 2000 AD, which... 2000 AD, the magazine of high science fiction adventure, that I talk about now in 2023. The past had such high hopes for us, and yet, sadly, we fell, well, short of their ideals. But, anywho, many of Judge Dredd's adventures can be found in the complete case files, which can still be relatively easily found across the web, and I highly do recommend it because it is some top-tier entertainment. Anywho, enough plugging, let's get back to 40k, as... despite their strength in the arts of the Control-C and the Control-V, the Adeptus Arbites are actually one of the oldest elements of Warhammer 40,000, having made their very first appearance all the way back in 1988 in the Realm of Chaos sourcebook, where they were a part of the Ordo Malus army list in the Dark Millennium, as it was called back then. And over the course of subsequent codexes and iterations of Warhammer 40k, the Arbites were actually a fairly consistent and major part of the tabletop wargame, with various rules that allowed them to be taken as auxiliary forces for Imperial Inquisitors, for example. There was even an official Adeptus Arbites army list released in 3rd edition, if memory serves, but I don't think they ever got a proper codex. They got a, one of those side codex thingies, like the unofficial edition compendium things. Oh, wait, no. No. It was the Citadel Journal, wasn't it? A kind of, a side magazine to White Dwarf, as back in the day, GW actually had several Games Workshop magazines. I believe they had, Battlefleet Gothic had one, and Epic had one as well. Did War Master have one? I can't bloody remember. But anyways, they did get an official army list, but it was in a magazine format rather than a fancy pants codex. But tragically, after 3rd edition, they started falling off the radar more and more and more, until in modern 40k, I don't think there even is rules for the Arbites anymore, as far as I'm aware, though I have heard some rumours that they might be making a return. I certainly wouldn't mind, because they are awfully goddamn cool, aren't they? Plus, I quite like their heroic portrayal of the police force, as, here's the thing, many have often argued that the Adeptus Arbites are some sort of caricature of an over-armed police force or a nightmarish police state, etc., etc. I very much so disagree. Because here's the thing, the Adeptus Arbites are, as mentioned, the police force of the Adeptus Terra specifically. They are the international, I suppose we could call them, peacekeepers of the galaxy. There are not enough of them, there are never enough of them, and those few that are around are spread ever so thinly, trying to maintain peace and order in a galaxy of uncountable sprawling trillions of humans, half the time living literally on top of each other in enormous, impossible-to-police hive cities, with entire sections buried so far underground as to practically be its own ecosystem and mini-kingdom. Bringing about any sort of protracted period of law and order and stability in these areas is a pipe dream within a pipe shoved up the arse of a greater demon of Tzeentch. It just ain't happening. And yet, the Arbites dedicate their entire lives to trying to achieve that impossible ideal. That alone is worthy of some admiration, surely. And in many cases, they go about the attempt to achieve this through indirect means. Here's the thing, the Adeptus Arbites, whilst we call them a policing force, honestly, in many ways, they are closer to Imperial Inquisitors, but bound by a legal codex, as they have the authority to punish pretty much anyone short of the highest ranking members of imperial aristocracy or the Inquisition itself. And the judgment of an arbiter may be swift and ruthless. Pump action shotgun to the back of the neck, ruthless. And the crimes that the Adeptus Arbites pursue are often not of the more traditional nature. Oh, don't get me wrong, an arbiter may very well decide to chase down a laundry thief if he so chooses. It is entirely within his authority to do so if he can find a suitable passage in the Lex Imperialis or his smaller Book of Laws. But usually the arbiters find that it is a much better use of their time to go after considerably larger fish, as the Lex Imperialis is, well, it is a legal tome, absolutely, but again, not quite the same as what we might consider a legal tone, as the Lex Imperialis is, in essence, a compilation of every single solitary decree ever made by the High Lords of the Imperium. And thus, in turn, of course, it means that it is a history of every single decree ever passed to the High Lords by the God Emperor himself. In other words, the Lex Imperialis and its physical form, the Book of Judgment, is a sacred text, and encompasses a hell of a lot more than simple rules surrounding base malfeasance, like thievery, or murder, or abuse, or anything like that. It is a set of laws dictating how the Imperium should be governed. And so any imperial governor getting a visit from the Adeptus Arbites should be a very, very nervous individual indeed, as he may have been found guilty of some oversight, or abuse of power, or simple incompetence. Which incidentally is a very broad term as far as the Lex Imperialis is concerned. Because you see, here's the beauty of imperial law. Since it is anything and everything any High Lord of Terror has ever said on behalf of, quote-unquote, the Emperor, it means that, in essence, everything is illegal inside of the Imperium of Man. Because at some point in the last 10,000 years, there will have been some High Lord who said that this or that wasn't allowed. Which is why the official wanted poster for Hermann von Straub, the previous overlord of Armageddon, included several hundred counts of incorrect dress. Now, of course, most of these rules are never actually enforced because, again, literally everything would be illegal. And in the vast majority of cases, local law will take precedence over imperial law up until the point where an arbiter says that it doesn't. making it in essence a question of whether or not a member of the Adeptus Arbites can be bothered to do anything about it. Theoretically, they could follow up on every tiny infraction of the enormous, literally countless volumes of the Lex Imperialis. And when I say that, I really do mean it. So, the Book of Judgment, which is the entire legal code of the Imperium, is housed on Holy Terra itself, in the Hall of Judgment, which is the main fortress of the Adeptus Arbites. Like any main Adeptus structure on Terra, this fortress is enormous, and yet entire wings of it is dedicated purely to the storage of the unfathomable number of volumes of the Book of Judgment. Now, certainly, parts of the parts of the volumes of Judgment, more correctly, are recorded on archaic scrolls, paper, hide, even supposedly leather of less than wholesome origins, etc. But enormous amounts of it will also be on simple data storage devices. Basically, imagine filling up the entirety of the Library of Congress with USB sticks crammed full of .txt files. And that would be your nation's legal code. I'm sure you can see the complications that might arise from such a arrangement. And, better yet, guess what? There is no rule anywhere in the Arbites system that says that a thing cannot be illegal twice. Meaning that the exact same thing can be outlawed as many times the High Lords decide, frankly, writing the same law over and over and over again, causing yet further bloat. And, as the piece de resistance, there is also no law stating that you need to remove a law at any point, meaning that, say for example, that at one point in the Imperium's history, wearing a fluffy hat on Sundays got you executed instantly by a bolt gun to the back of the head. But after a few hundred years, a High Lord noticed this law and said, well, that's a bit ridiculous, and decided to say, no, you get to go outside with fluffy hats even on Sundays without getting shot, but on Tuesdays, however, your ass is grass. In this case, both laws would still technically be on the books, but there is a newer decree stating that the previous law do not apply. Okay, easy enough. Simple dimple, you know? You've got one law and then you've got one law saying, nah, that law doesn't matter anymore. Okay. Now think that you've got 10,000 years of these laws, all stacking on top of each other in a never-ending parody of justice. As in this beautiful system, something could be illegal and legal at the exact same time, 20 times in a row, and the only question as to whether or not it is legal or illegal comes down to the casework of the arbiter in question and how far he is willing to dig. And to be fair, some of them are willing to dig very, very far, as there are indeed some arbiters who essentially make careers out of simply looking through singular cases for decades after decades after decades after decades, and in some cases centuries even, just to make sure that one particular judgment is 100,000% correct and up to date with any and all qualifications, exceptions, and mandates. Unfortunately for the seedy underbelly of the Imperium, most arbitrators are nowhere near that level of autism. And generally speaking, once an arbitrator has decided to hand down a judgment, it is final, and it is carried out very swiftly, without any chance whatsoever of appeal. As it is rather difficult to appeal a shotgun shell after it's entered into your skull. Luckily, for anyone worried about the state of justice in the Imperium, most crime that the Adeptus Arbites decide to engage themselves with tends to be the obvious kind. There's not a lot of arbiters, and their time is extraordinarily precious, and so they tend to make sure that when they dedicate themselves to something, it is something that they can actually wrap up. Although, again, exceptions do exist. Incidentally, if you're curious what happens if you should be found guilty long after you've actually died of natural causes, since arbiters are often awarded with far more in the way of rejuvenative treatments than any normal human, well, in those cases, the guilt passes down the familiar line. Naturally. Why not? It's the Imperium of Man, after all, and being unreasonable is pretty much part of the rulebook. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it was literally written somewhere that the Arbites need to retain a certain degree of unreasonability to maintain the faith and fear of the public. But long, in-depth investigations tend to be more the realms of the lone arbiter. The poor bastard assigned to an entire solar system by himself, who just has the longest list of things to do in human history. And at this point, he's just nailed it to the wall, and he's throwing darts to decide what he needs to do next. Whether that be grand larceny, where a child stole an apple, or accusations of incompetence against the local planetary governor. These are more the Batman-style judges that actually have to do pretty much everything on their own. Obviously, the arbiters have access to any and all local police resources as well. If they tell them to raid a building, that's what they do. If he requires lab results back, or forensic investigations, or anything else, they are at his beck and call. And they also have access to a hell of a lot more resources as well, as they're a little bit of the FBI in a way, as of course the Arbitrators have access to the entire Imperium's databanks on history, profiles, crimes, all kinds of nonsense. These isolated arbitrators also, I imagine, might also turn into almost semi-inquisitors in their own way. Not with the same scope or scale, but they would almost certainly build up a little bit of an informal staff around them to, keep shit going. Meanwhile, we haven't talked about the big city arbiters yet. The guys in the actual game, the guys you keep seeing the art of, the dudes with the enormous riot shields and the power maws, beating the shit out of hordes of civilians and/or, hopefully, chaos cultists on occasion. Because there are those places in the Imperium that are large enough, powerful enough, and important enough to actually warrant a de facto garrison of the Adeptus Arbites, where they become a militarized police force would actually be putting it a little bit lightly, frankly, considering the resources and the armaments available to the Adeptus Arbites, not to mention, again, the scale of their authority. They are more like imagine a military police, but tasked primarily with civilian justice, and you're kinda close, except even more heavily armed. Imagine the Waffen-SS of World War II, except policing. The Warsaw Uprisings, there you've got a good example. Just replace Warsaw with an enormous hive city, and the Polish freedom fighters with 8 armed tentacle monsters. A rough comparison, I agree, but close. And, incidentally, the way of policing would also resemble the aforementioned uprising quite well, too. Now, the Arbites do engage in just simple riot control as well, like taking care of food riots, for example, is the oft-mentioned example, or dealing with crime syndicates. They are a policing force, and they will do basic bitch police stuff as well. But they will also engage in straight-up mass military raids on underhive cities and population centers suspected of harboring unsavory elements of the general civil populace. And whilst arrests are, a nice bonus during these raids, it is not the primary purpose of the action, as demonstrated by the fact that they usually bring straight-up bolt guns, shotguns, and tanks. Though, to be fair, considering the level of armament of the average underhive, you kinda have to. As, oddly enough, ye old water cannon does not work quite as well against, your average Goliath ganger. Now, these raids are also usually carried out by, specialist personnel, as there are quite a few different types of arbitrators as well. In the case of raids against underhives, or when targeting particularly uncooperative elements of the criminal underworld, executioner teams are usually dispatched. These guys don't really care over much about arrests at all. They already know that the target is guilty of something, and it is well within their power to put them the hell down. Which would again put them in sharp contrast to the shock troopers. These guys, as the name somewhat implies, are all about shock and awe, and primarily directed towards non-criminal elements. Again, breaking up riots, or making sure that civilian protests don't get too uppity, stuff like that. Their job isn't to kill anyone, though, bashing someone over the head with a heavy electrified maul can have that effect on occasion, and they won't feel particularly bad about it, but they are there primarily to disperse the rioters rather than outright murder them. And if bludgeoning a couple of them into bloody messes on the side of the road will disperse them quicker, well, as I said, they won't feel too bad about it. But if these guys are the SWAT, the Special Forces, there are also more traditional policing roles like detectives, or chasteners, or snatch teams, who deal with things like discovering crimes that are underway, figuring out criminal plans, figuring out the location of criminals, abducting people to interrogate the location of criminals from people who may or may not be associated with the criminals, and so on and so on. There is also no specific reason why an Arbites officer needs to be one thing or the other, and I imagine whilst there is obviously a degree of specialization, there will be some overlap as well. Definitely, even a shock trooper member will have some idea of how to do detective work, just like an executioner's team guy will have some expertise in breaking up rioters, and so on and so on. And speaking of specialization, obviously there is going to be various degrees within the many ranks. You could be a specialized interrogator, you could be the leader of a snatch squad, or you could even be a cybercrime specialist. Hate crimes in the 41st millennium. Imagine that. Or, one of the most highly valued ranks would be suffering marshal. These guys are de facto bounty hunters, dispatched to very distant frontiers, often spanning entire solar systems or more, in order to track down very specific prey. These guys are given a tremendous degree of independence, allowed to travel pretty much wherever they need to go, and use any and all means necessary to apprehend and usually execute whomever they have been assigned to capture. Again, mini inquisitors in a way. These roles, of course, with all the freedom inherent with them, are only given out to the most, determined of individuals. Those with a very, very long and proven track record of zealous perfection in the name of imperial law. And as the name suggests, suffering marshal, they're pretty damn far up on the rank chain as well. As usually, you've got your average trooper, then you move on to enforcer and regulator, investigator, arbitrator, protector, and then marshal. The only position above that would be a justicar, or a lord marshal, those who are in charge of significant numbers of other arbitrators. And generally speaking, wherever there is a justicar, there is going to be a major Adeptus Arbites present, probably with a precinct fortress as well. These enormous buildings are, as the name suggests, literal fortresses. They can vary in scale and scope, size, and of complements of Arbites, but the basic duty of all precinct fortresses is much the same: to keep the Arbites safe from the people that they are supposed to protect. Well, mostly from the criminal elements that might have a very good reasons to try and lash out at the Arbites, but also, yes, often against the civilian populace, as, well, symbols of imperial authority tend to become very, very unpopular during periods of chaos uprisings, or rebellions in general, and so making sure that aforementioned imperial paraphernalia is mounted on top of a hardened plascrete bunker is a very good way to make sure that it remains imperial. This level of fortification, in turn, often means that the precinct fortress of the Adeptus Arbites is the last place standing during a major chaos insurrection, rebellion, or even straight-up invasion. Now, the Arbites, for all of their firepower, are still primarily a policing force, and their access to truly heavy equipment is rather limited. They can have straight-up tanks like the Lehman Russ, or Sentinels, or Chimeras, even Rhinos, in fact, and that is certainly a significant amount of firepower. They also possess sentry guns, Valkyries, and various light aircraft too, so it's not like they can't deal with even heavily armored vehicles and such threats. But they're not really equipped to do so. They have very little, if anything, in the way of anti-tank personnel weaponry, for example, crack launchers, or las cannons, or large plasma weaponry. So if anything, they would have to rely on a usually fairly small stable of their own heavy vehicles. In other words, the Adeptus Arbites should not be engaging the enemy in open field firefights. But if they are allowed to engage in good old-fashioned urban combat, which is likely considering where their precincts are usually located, they can be a very, very dangerous fighting force that can operate alongside and adjacent to the Imperial Guard or other elements. They even have a fair bit of more powerful weaponry as well, like shock batons or power moles. Plus, if you're in the Adeptus Arbites, you're probably going to be a rather determined fella, not used to giving ground or surrendering, and as such they're going to be very determined opponents. I believe even, an example from recent lore, it almost makes my stomach turn, but it is a good example of this. The second battle for Terra, the Battle of the Lion's Gate. Adeptus Arbites forces were heavily involved in the urban fighting on Terra and throughout the Imperial Palace, both inside and outside. Now, in that case, the Adeptus Arbites were not able to maintain peace and order on Terra's countless vast hives, as the planet began descending into chaos, and it also suddenly spawned many chaos cults. Oh god. Not going to get too into it here, but the entire idea of that battle, it smells too much of Age of Sigmar to me, honestly. Too much of a sheer spectacle, rather than a realistic military confrontation. Already, the Gathering Storm and Reboot Gilliman's epic journey to Terra, where I think he gets defeated and captured like 3 times, was pushing my ability to suspend my disbelief. But then, apparently, out of nowhere, countless hordes of demons just appear on Terra and descend upon the planet with no forewarning whatsoever. Was it 88 demonic cohorts or some such nonsense led by Khorne's most vicious bloodthirsters? Now, granted, this was during the, what was the cringe-ass name? Noctis Aeterna, that was it, when the Eye of Terror expanded. So okay, sure, there is some fluctuations in the galaxy at large, but maintaining that number of demons for an extended assault right next to Terra, it it pushes what is reasonably possible within the rules of the 41st millennium. Because again, remember, when Angron invaded Armageddon, he had to pause for a very long time and build enormous altars, sacrificing tens of thousands, if not millions of civilians to stabilize his own presence and that of his demonic allies. And he brought a hell of a lot less demons than this invasion. Not to mention, right next to Terra as well. And then the countless Chaos cults. Now sure, there's going to be some Chaos cults even on Terra, as it is a ridiculously overpopulated mess, but it is also one of the most secure locations in the entire Imperium. Populated by the Custodes, the Inquisition's headquarters, the Adeptus Arbites headquarters, etc, etc, etc. Surely, life on Terra as a Chaos cultist must be rather trying, right? But it is a good example of the Arbites engaging with even the heaviest of opposition. Though usually they'll be fighting in slightly softer things, like, massive gene-stealer uprisings, for example. Whenever there is an Adeptus Arbites presence, and whenever there is an invasion, you will find them in the streets doing their best to maintain peace and order, no matter the odds, because that is what they sign up for, and that is what they do every day. The fact that the enemy this time is a straight-up invader, well, it just simplifies things, doesn't it? No need to hunt them down or discover where they're hiding. You just need to pull the trigger. And with that, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.